and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I loved Susie's image of the barn raising, so I'm going to share with you some of the foundational beams I've been working on for the last 25 years and look forward to getting to know your parts of the barn as we put them together. My talk is called Psychic, Social, and Eco-Decolonization for the Commons to Be. What do transformations to sustainability look like? The question calls us to remember successful projects that still sing to us and to share the visionary ideas that feed our imagination of the possible. It asks us not only to imagine endpoints, but the processes we engender to these ends. My vantage point is from psychologies of liberation that have flowed from the south to the north. They have as their interdependent goals ecological sustainability, social, economic, and environmental justice, and dynamic peace building and reconciliation, giving priority, as we talked about earlier, to the poor and the marginalized. Central to reconciliation is humans remembering themselves as part of the living being of nature itself, albeit a member that is having a profoundly destructive impact. These are psychologies of restoration that have arisen to address the tragic effects of colonialism and neoliberal globalization. Unlike most of mainstream psychology, they are built on a paradigm of interdependence that sees sustainability as inseparable from human well-being. One visionary idea that can guide us is the recovery of the commons. Gustavo Esteva, from Mexico, suggests that we practice shifting our unit of understanding to the commons rather than the person. This approach is certainly resonant with the visionary indigenous philosophies of Buen Vivir and Sumek Kwazai from Bolivia and Ecuador that understand good living arising from our harmony with ourselves, our communities, and our living environment. Commoners take according to genuine need rather than manufactured desire and according to what is sustainable. The commons is not seen as resources to be depleted for individuals' personal profit. Through evolving consensus, there are customs of restraint that are communally upheld that protect the commons. Colonialism and transnational capitalism, with its largely unregulated market economics, have disrupted people's organization into communally-oriented groups that share a commons. Throughout the world, the seizure of commons has led to the collapse of local cultures, the loss of languages and spiritualities, the destruction of sustainable practices, and the degradation of the natural environment. The commons movement attempts to support communities that still have commons while encouraging other local communities to develop commons, replacing external control and extraction with local attunement to the needs of people in the ecosystem. Vandana Shiva describes the kind of earth democracy necessary to the commons as dependent on our developing sensitivity to our mutuality with nature, to our remembering that we owe our own well-being to it, and that all species and ecosystems have rights to existence. In earth democracy, we assume a duty to ensure our actions do not cause harm and acknowledge that selling nature's resources for profit, quote, violates our inherent right to nature's gifts and denies the poor of their rights. Through a sense of the sacred being of nature, the earth democracy of the commons commits us to conserve and not to overuse, abuse, waste, or pollute, to be respectful of ecological and just limits. How do we build together earth democracy to recover ourselves as commoners, where we become sensitized not only to our own and others' genuine needs, but also to the needs of nature? The same forces that have destroyed the commons have destroyed through violence, deceit, corruption, exploitation, the delicate interdependent ties between peoples, and those most fragile of membranes of exchange, those in the mind where we metabolize differences and recover psychic space for multiplicity, empathic attunement, ambiguity, and the unknown. The recovery of the commons requires a corollary recovery of dialogical practices that mend the fabric of community. We must create psychic and social spaces where we can recuperate a sense of well-being and vitality, where we can unfurl our thoughts, images, and desires with one another, and discover modes of thinking and acting in solidarity to create a sustainable way of life together. Now, there are not many psychologists in the room, I don't think, but as one, I want to turn our attention to these intimate realms of subjectivity, interpersonal and intergroup relationships. For these, I believe, are critical to the kinds of systemic transformation we are working toward. The seeds of coloniality that undermine our relationships with ourselves, one another, and the environment need to be acknowledged. And as in a Buddhist approach, the seeds of post-colonial relationships need to be sowed to crowd out the destructive patterns that have been part and parcel of our movement into deeper ecological catastrophe. In colonial relationships, the dignity of the grassroots, the people, el pueblo, the marginalized, the majorities, is not recognized. Neither are their members seen as knowledge creators, as deep dreamers for their societies, and as actors in solidarity with others capable of profound transformations. In neoliberal globalization, they are often viewed as in the way of progress, able to be displaced, backward, in need of leadership from the outside, and significant for their potential as cheap labor rather than for their knowledge and vision. But even a cursory look will defeat this maligning view, as many indigenous groups inspire right living in partnership with the environment, are able to think transgenerationally in terms of the impact of our present actions on the earth and our future ancestors, and act with a reverence for the earth and all living beings. The toll of colonial relations is too often intensified, I believe, by academic research regimes that are developed outside of the communities to which they are applied. Community members' understandings and interpretations go largely unlistened to. The results of interventions are published in places out of reach of the community that was, quote, intervened upon. The slow, deliberative processes that are necessary for working together are sidestepped, leaving most community members disempowered, passive recipients of processes that they have not been consulted about or consented to, processes that they may not even adequately understand. Now, Paulo Freire, the Brazilian pedagogist, warned us against imposing our dream on others rather than being deeply curious about their dreams. He called it cultural invasion as opposed to cultural synthesis. Participatory approaches to research and community action have developed to help redress this failure of normative research that unwittingly is conducted in a colonial mode, contributing to further collapse of psychic and social spaces. Such collaborative approaches are committed to opening and sustaining dialogical space so that a different manner of relating to one another and to ourselves can develop and grow roots to steady us as we work towards sustainability. Participatory action research seeks an integrity of means and ends, rather than pursuing a new future through the continued use of colonizing practices. Work for ecological sustainability is understood to rest on the creation of sustainable human relations of mutual respect, trust, understanding, and co-creation. But what are the pillars of interpersonal relations that are capable of holding up work for a sustainable world, a set of millions of interlinked commons? Embodying these will allow our means to be congruent with our ends, our path consistent with our dreamed of destination of sustainability. And the next slide is of Ignacio Martinez, whom frankly I want to commemorate today. Saturday was the 25th anniversary of his assassination in El Salvador, along with 5 other Jesuits. Ignacio Martinez was the person who brought first the ideas of liberation theology into psychology, naming liberation psychology. And he argued that, quote, the foundation for a people's mental health lies in the existence of humanizing relationships, of collective ties within which and through which the personal humanity of each individual is acknowledged and in which no one's reality is denied. He understood mental health, and we could add ecological health, as, quote, the manifestation in a person or group of the humanizing or alienating character of a framework of historical relationships, end of quote. This manner of relationship has the following practices that can be foundational to our work with groups and communities. Dialogue. Practicing dialogical and collaborative approaches recognizes and affirms the dignity of all partners and conveys trust in the capacity of each to develop and share knowledge so that the working group can move toward more adequate understandings and meaningful actions. The practice of gratitude. Buddhist eco-philosopher Joanna Macy urges us to ground our lives and work for sustainability in practices of gratitude, gathering from gratitude the energy, joy, and moisture for our eco-activism. Such practices steady us in a realm that lies beyond consumerism. Julio Monsalvo in the Second People's Health Assembly in Cuenca, Ecuador, names and describes the feeling that arises from this aliveness as alegría, quote, the bubbling, fizzing joy in our blood, helping us leap over mountains of doubt and fear, dissolving pride and racing past petty disagreements. Appreciative inquiry. Appreciative inquiry orients us to learn together about what is working within a community that is relevant to an area of inquiry. Rather than suppose that meaningful transformation is stimulated from the outside of a community, care is given to articulating and celebrating what is already working in a resilient and sustainable way in a given context. Cooper Ryder and Srivastava, co-founders of Appreciative Inquiry, emphasize that through appreciative practices, participants can recognize themselves and their organizations as expressions of beauty and spirit. In focusing in this way, one can avoid contributing to feelings of defeat and hopelessness, and instead contribute to feelings of enthusiasm, liveliness, creative competence, pride, and hope. And of course, these aren't discrete. Appreciative inquiry is really a form of practice of gratitude, and they all rely on dialogue. Now, we've been talking sporadically about conscientization, which is an idea that comes first from Paulo Freire. And following his lead, liberation psychology focuses on communities' development of critical consciousness, creating understandings that can place their local challenges in historical and socioeconomic and political contexts. Conscientization disrupts the tendency to normalize and passively accept unjust and unsustainable arrangements of everyday life, and begins to help community members assume a sense of agency with respect to the difficulties in their communities and bioregions. In order for community members to see that the ecological situation can be transformed, they must first understand how the present state of affairs was constructed, for what purposes, and for whose profit. In Freirean work, the posing of generative questions is the key to this process. The art of crafting generative questions is often overlooked as academics assemble their own expertise and learn to communicate it through scholarly means. Freire recounts that when he was a young man, he went to a community meeting and lectured to the people present about their problems and the solutions he proposed. His wife, Ilse, had accompanied him, and when he got home, he realized that she was quite cross with him. He asked her, why are you treating me like this, Ilse? What, you seem upset with me. And she confided, look, Paulo, it does not work like this. And Freire says he answered, what did I do? I spoke serious about serious things. And she said, well, yes, of course, all you said is right. But did you ask them whether they were interested in listening to you speak about that? You gave them the answers and the questions. According to Freire, this moment marked the beginning of his most important contribution to liberatory education, the creation of a problem-posing methodology that seeks to bring into awareness what people know about their struggles and their dreams for themselves and their communities. The right questions have the capacity to empower those we are in dialogue with, helping them to access their knowledge and vision. Freire, at the second part of Freire's methodology, he called enunciation. We could call it community visioning. Understanding how the situation was constructed is essential to seeing that it is not inevitable and that it can be created otherwise. Community members can begin to dream together the more desirable state of their eco-community. Through dialogical practice, a consensus can be developed regarding the dreams of the community and a path created to move toward them. And I want to give as an example the Green Belt movement in Kenya. Its leader, Wangari Maathai, realized that many of the women she was working with did not see themselves as having the knowledge and skills to impact their situation. They located the source of power outside themselves and believed that solutions could only be proposed from the outside by experts. The women were encouraged to articulate the difficulties they were suffering from: lack of adequate firewood, clean drinking water, balanced diet, shelter, and income. These pointed to a common dream of a restored ecosystem in which the families could better thrive. Through dialogical approaches to consciousness raising, their local daily difficulties were linked with the regional issues of deforestation and desertification and corrupt state governance. This linkage of local problems with the larger regional ecosystem and the economic and political situation that had impacted it suggested points of leverage and a potential path toward restoration. When she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004, she recognized the success of the women's work: 30 million trees, 6,000 income jobs, 6,000 income-producing tree nurseries, 100,000 jobs. The women learned to hold their government leaders accountable for abuses of power, corruption, and environmental mismanagement. But importantly, this was not only a protest movement, encouraging those with power to change their ways. The women at the same time held themselves responsible to building community that manifested values of justice, integrity, and trust, values that they also wanted their leaders to embrace. And I'm just going to summarize the next ones, which are interrelated. Horizontality, which is a concept that comes from the movement in Argentina from 2001, that was ingredient in the Occupy movements. Consensus building, and the practice of deep democracy, which is key to consensus building when you give particular attention to listening to those who are in the minority position, so that the wisdom of their own knowledge can be integrated in some ways, even if the consensus developed doesn't end up agreeing with their point of view. So I have just one more thing I want to share with you from Martin Barreau. He says, I believe there's an extremely urgent task of education for mental health, and this task consists in training and socializing so that people's desires truly conform to their needs. This means that our subjective aspirations, both as groups and as individuals, must be oriented toward the satisfaction of our needs. In other words, toward the requirements that lead us down the path of our humanization, and not those which tie us to compulsive consumption. This would perhaps be the best psychotherapy for the effects of war, and surely the best mental hygiene for building our future. Now, just several warnings. Critics of the discourse of transformation are telling us that we are in a romance with this word transformation, and that when we invoke it, it isn't necessarily describing what we're desiring, that we need to be very active in ascertaining if our actions actually bring about the state of affairs that we're wanting. And lastly, that this language of the pillars of relationship can be invoked in proposals when we say we're going to do participatory research, but often they're invoked rather than being deeply embodied. And what I'm suggesting is that in many instances we need to slow down and really root ourselves in the evolving relationships with the people in the communities we're working with. Thank you.